In this video, we're looking at agriculture. Agriculture is a fantastically massive subject which incorporates all different disciplines of science, including geology, atmospheric science, soil science, human anthropology, human history, and the development of technologies and methods to farm and produce crops. Now, this video is looking at the revolutions and changes from the past 20,000 years. This is the Earth Science Classroom. Agriculture includes all different topics, and generally it's the topic or discussion of growing plants, crops, including animals, and providing food for humans in a sustainable method in a way that can feed the population. Now, this has changed over the last 20,000 years and has gone along with the changes that humans have experienced in the way that humans live and the population increase and the ways in which we have incorporated technology into our lives to make our lives better and obviously grow populations and the human race as we know on this planet. And agriculture has followed along with the demand of what humans place upon it for food and the demand for food on a daily basis. And agriculture has changed over time, and we're looking at these revolutions since mankind or the human species have settled down into settlements. So the first revolution is around 12,000 years ago and can date back to as long as 20,000 years ago, and these dates are contested based on different locations of where these ancient relics and artifacts and sites are found, denoting or showing when this started, which is humans were very nomadic, and they would move from place to place in search of food and try and catch their food and search for their food in different locations around the African continent, the Middle East, into Asia and Europe. Now, this extent and expansion of humans into the Middle East led the first great revolution to happen around Mesopotamia, which is basically means its middle river. And this is based around the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq and Kuwait. Now, this area of the Middle East was the first area to settle down humans, and they started to domesticate certain animals and cultivate crops in this arable land. Now, around the river was great because it had natural irrigation, some rainfall, and some precip, but there was this ideal location to start to settle down, and humans have this one location in which they build around and farm and produce food to eat. And that was the first revolution, was the nomadic to settlement and changing the methods and whole way that humans go about collecting and consuming food. And these ancient farmers would go about manually laboring their farms and their land and producing enough food for their families, or maybe some extra for the local people in the village. But it was very small, very manual intensive, and it was the start of this whole revolution that we are now experiencing for the last 12,000 years. The second revolution came between the 16th and 19th century and was centered around Europe and North America and other areas, and it took a long time to get to this revolution, whereby you had this increased population, which of course resulted in an increased demand for more food. So the yield, the amount of crops produced by the average farmer and the average land, had to increase to provide for the larger demand. And to do that, you had to change your techniques. You had to make things more efficient, quicker, produce more crops on that land and produce for longer times, and really start to control the whole environment, whereby you can produce more food and be able to provide the correct nutrients in the right methods and techniques and the right amount of irrigation and water to produce these crops to sell and to provide the food source for a growing population. And this coincided with Europe, North America, going through industrialization and how everything became mechanized and factory-based, and the labor system changed into a more efficient system which produced more goods, more materials quicker and for cheaper, and materials became much more abundant, and transportation, communication, and trade, and the creation of a larger market from which to buy and sell and move all these materials. And this included the crops, and the farmers went with these changes and started to integrate machinery like the steel plow in 1819, the light tractor, the mechanized seed planter, and started to produce large-scale irrigation systems onto their land. They started doing monocropping and just looking at certain crops that would sell, the cash crops that would sell, like the wheat and the corn and maize and alfalfa and soybeans that were high in demand, that could be used for multiple different types of food and sold as grain. And then you got the transportation of food, the emergence of the steam engine and the automobile in the late 1800s, and the ability to move these crops, these materials, over large distances to provide for the demand. And where the demand is around the big cities, and these farms aren't always around the big cities, so they had to produce ways and make ways to move the food that was grown to the markets and to the high population centers. Then you get the advances in food production. So these crops and these seeds are starting to be selected based on their quality and reused each season. And also looking at turning common land into privately owned farmland, which farmers have access to and have ownership over, so that they can manage and cultivate more efficiently without having to worry about other people involved. And again, it became more of a business and commercialized, and it began all of that producing food for more money. Then there was also the decrease in labor force. When you have more machines working on your farm, and you have these efficient methods of irrigation and seed planting and tillage and plowing and cultivating the crops, you don't need as many workers, so it becomes faster, and you produce this food in a much quicker time scale. So the second revolution was really just the ability for farmers to produce higher yields of their crops, or one or two crops, and become more modernized with technology, with machines, and increase their productivity. So on to the third revolution. Now, some argue this is the final revolution that we're currently in, and some articles, some journals, some textbooks, some experts do argue that we are in a fourth revolution. But either way, the third revolution was called the Green Revolution. And this happened in 1960 to around 1990s. And this was also due to the end of World War II and the stability of certain countries and the ability to provide for a much higher demand from growing populations. Now, some countries were expanding exponentially with their food demands, China for one, North America for a second, and obviously Africa. Now, this was also because of food scarcity in some countries after the war. So the ability for farmers to, again, go through changes with their technology and their methods and techniques to produce even more food from that single piece of land or farmland was the next step. It was the next thing that was demanded of these farmers to meet demand from the public. So the first development was rice and wheat was exponentially increased in production and yield. Then you had the introduction of agrochemicals. So you had pesticides and fertilizers and insecticides and herbicides being used in a more relaxed manner during the second revolution, where you have the introduction of these chemicals or these methods to reduce pests and to increase the nutrients the plants needs, like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, and to regulate the pH of the soil, which would also help to stimulate crop growth through the quality of the soil. And of course, you have the irrigation methods to irrigate accurately and to the right amount that the plant needs based on the climate. So these synthetic fertilizers that were introduced during this time of the third revolution were laboratory-made fertilizers that really did pinpoint exactly what the plant needed in terms of the nutrients. So it was more of a exact method than a general average. Then we have the selective breeding. So we had this since ancient times, back 12,000 years ago, where the farmers would realize, oh, that's a good crop, and they would save the seeds to the crops that were good and grown and produce food. So that's been happening for thousands of years. However, large-scale breeding and selection of seeds that were more profitable and beneficial in that area, in that soil, in that climate, were now becoming commercialized and patented, and now companies were able to take control of that seed and organize it in whatever way they wanted to, and influence farmers in what seeds they choose to use. Then we have the development and implementation of GMO crops. GMO is the genetically modified organisms, where you take a part of the plant, and which is not a positive part. For example, corn, with BT corn. Corn was being attacked by this small insect, and the insect would eat and lay eggs on the corn and eventually destroy the corn and then reproduce. So farmers would lose a lot of their corn yields through this insect. Now, BT corn was created to address this issue and put in an extra code into the plant's DNA that would allow the plant to naturally produce an insect repeller within the plant. There was no need for an extra pesticide to be sprayed on this corn. It was naturally doing it through its own DNA, and this would severely reduce and remove the insects from eating the corn. So of course the farmer would have a higher yield of corn, more money generated from the sale of larger amounts of corn. So this was a win-win for the farmers. So the birth of this genetically modified organism, in this case the crops, was born because the farmers saw all positives. Now, in terms of the long-term effect on the environment, yes, that's still being researched and nothing's ever perfect. But in terms of the farmer's point of view, at that point in time, in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, they were very happy to use this BT corn. So, yields of these crops were consistent and large production numbers, regardless of the climate, the soil, the latitude, the season, and the amount of precip, because we could now control the soil, control the water, control the insects and the pests, and control the exact fertilizer that's need to be applied through synthetic means, and obviously through GMO crops start to reduce all those issues that would take away from the yield each year from the farmer. Then we have the modern irrigation techniques, the application of putting the water in the exact place at the exact time, using machines, using industrial size and industrial scale of applying water regardless of the climate. Now, there obviously comes some disadvantages with this, which is the excess machinery, which is use of gasoline, the excess of food and more waste produced, the stress on the land, the constant cultivation, the constant non-till or tillage, and the application of generic pesticides and fertilizers and insecticides that would wash off with the overland flow into rivers and streams and cause eutrophication and cause various pollution issues in those environments. But however, the positives was the huge increase in yield, the introduction mainstream of GMO crops, and the ability for the farmer to produce more food on the same acre of land or provide for the food demand. Now we're up to more modern times towards the present, and we're into what's known as the fourth agricultural revolution. Now this is to do with the full-blown headfirst into GMO crops in terms of expanding the range of crops that we can modify genetically for different outcomes. Outcomes like higher levels of natural defenses against insects and pests and weed killers, and the increase in size of the actual crop that's being grown, the corn, the wheat, the soybean, the ability for the genetic code to be changed so it's more resistant to drought conditions or more resistant to flood and high levels of precip conditions based on the area, the climate, and based on the location. It might be a lack of a certain nutrient in that soil or a certain fluctuation in pH, which we can genetically change within that crop to be resistant or be productive and produce the food all year round, regardless of the angle of the sun, the insect level, the weed level, the soil quality, or the climate conditions, or even the wind. So GMO crops have the ability to actively change all the issues and provide no way or no reason for any crops not to have a high yield and farmers not to produce on a consistent yearly basis the food that is requested and demanded from an ever-growing population. Currently, we're at a little over 8 billion people, and projections go up to 9.5 to 10 to 11 billion by 2050. And the issue of how to provide that amount of food for that amount of people comes from the farmers and this stress on the land. And a way to reduce the stress and reduce the issues of the environment is to push and develop these GMO crops. And that's really what the fourth revolution is all about, is that influx of highly detailed technology introduced into every crop, into every food and meal we consume, and the ability for corporations to own the food in various ways and control what we eat in various ways, which again is going to supply what the demand is based on population. Now, of course, not every area of the world has the same amount of food and the same amount of nutrients and the same calories that are required as per other countries, but hopefully with the GMO expansion and revolution, there's a way to feed everyone in the world with the right amount of nutrients, the right amount of clean water, the right amount of calories, and everything that humans need to be healthy and live a long time. And that is what we're trying to do with these revolutions of agriculture, is provide food and create a way that humans can survive, live a long life, healthy life, and reproduce and keep the human race going. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like it, please subscribe and maybe hit the like button. If you like more on this content, please check out my channel, which has all these videos on earth science.